recording after the fact, they can. And today, this was a request by Toyohito. So Toyohito, thank you for the lecture request, and I'm excited to dig into it. So we're going to be covering composition, and a lot of times when people think of composition, they think of your kind of leading lines or your value comps, or they'll think of like sometimes like the rule of threes, where you like put your focal element on the point between the rules of threes and stuff like that. And basically, what I would like to do today is to do my absolute best to turn that kind of on its head, basically by considering those as components of composition, but they in and of themselves are not composition. And so I think composition's a topic that is very often kind of misunderstood or overcomplicated. And so, what I want to do is try to give kind of my take on composition and how I apply it, and a way of thinking about it that kind of unlocked that I don't know, unlocked that stuckness for me, because I was on a plateau for that for a really long time. Hello, Egan, welcome. And these are the things that worked for me. So there's a billion art tutorials that you can find on like YouTube where it's like, okay, we're going to cover composition, and you put it on the rule of threes and all of that stuff. And that stuff's great. And we will touch on it a little bit. But I'm gonna try to convince you in the next 20 to 30 minutes that that is not the essence of composition, and that it is in fact something else. So before we talk about composition at all, we do have to do a little side tour on two elements of contrast. These are basically like our toolkit for controlling composition. And without these, you really can't have convincing composition, at least unless you like randomly stumble onto it, like monkey at a typewriter stuff. So very quickly, I'm going to give a blanket rule, and then I'm going to give some examples. And if you want to dig into this more in your own time, you can, because this is another thing that is like everywhere online. But whenever we put anything on our canvas, we are making a statement. And whenever we put anything else on the canvas, those two things will contrast in some way. What do I mean by that? So for example, if we've got our little canvas here, let's take a look at a few options. So right now we've got essentially like a blank space. If I put a line on this like this, we're starting to make a statement about that space. And this is getting a little, this is going to sound like hokey, but we're artists. I'm sure we can all handle it. When we make a statement about this space, like immediately we've created two shapes. We've created shape A and we've created shape B. And we've created like a sense of interaction between those two shapes. We can tell where on the canvas they're touching, right? If I make another mark on my canvas, let's put a circle on here. Regardless of where I put that circle, we're starting to make more and more statements about that space, but also about the elements within that space. So for example, if I put the circle here, we put him in a space where there, or in an area where there is less space on the canvas, so he's going to feel a little bit claustrophobic. If we put the circle over here, we're making a balanced composition, and he's got more room to breathe, right? And now it's like these two are having a face-off, right? This is super duper basic stuff, but it's important to kind of have in mind, because these are like the monkey brain instant read tools that we're going to use later to really control compositions. The other thing that we get is a contrast of type here. In this case, I'm not working with color or value or anything like that, but we have a straight line and a round circle, and those are also contrasting against each other. So that's worth noting. When we start to have lots of objects on our scene, we will tend to break it down into different types of contrast. And the blanket rule is like, if it is a component of art, it can contrast. So you could have contrast of line, for example, where you have some item in the background like this, and then some item in the foreground like this. This is contrast of line. This is also contrast of size. But this is making a statement about the space and about what we're seeing, right? You can have contrast of edge, where if you've got a bunch of like hard-edged shapes in your scene, even if they're the same color, roughly same shape, roughly same size, right? But then there's an edge contrast on one, that one's going to jump out, right? Because it's different. And essentially, when we talk about an element of contrast, we are just talking about difference. That's it. So our eyes are going to be drawn when we think about a focal area, we're going to be drawn to the focal area that has the most difference with other stuff on our scene. And it really is that straightforward. Um, you can get very creative with how you create contrast. This is contrast of edge. We could have contrast of type. So we could do something like this. I'm sure everybody can guess like and notice where their eyes are drawn right now, right? Because this is a different type than the rest of the stuff on the canvas. We can have contrast of shape. So a good example is if we have like this, right? We get a focal area. This is a contrast of shape. The other thing where it starts to get really interesting is you can mix these. So for example, we could have, let me think, what's another type? We can have contrast of texture as well, but that's going to be very hard to show on a chalkboard. Let's do contrast of value. This is the most common one that's used, where we've got basically like very separate values in each other, like this. This is a contrast of value, where we've got dark on light and we've got light on dark. And then if we want to get fancy, we're working in two values right now, right? But if we really want to open things up, we can work in a third value, and then we can have like light on light or medium on light and medium on dark, right? And these are going to get pretty close to what I'm sure you've seen before as like those value thumbnails, where you'll see artists like, here's my thumbnail, right? So this is that kind of a thing. So here we've got our value contrast, but then we can also add other things. So we can add contrast of edge into this composition. We can add contrast of type into this composition as well. So for example, we've got these kind of weird triangle shapes because that's the shape of my brush. Um, so if I want this to really stand out here, maybe let's make this gray thing our focal area. So we can add, for instance, I'm going to keep everything else hard edged. I'm going to give it some soft edges. So we're giving it a little bit of contrast of edge. We're going to give it contrast of shape because it's going to be this very boxy, blocky shape where everything else is more loosey-goosey, like this. We're giving it contrast of value because it's standing out against this thing. Right now we have a competing focal point because this is contrasting too, so let's take that out. Or we could even, we could make a lesser contrast. For example, just to show, if I put gray over here, we're still going to end up with a focal area on the right. This is a secondary focus now, but the reason that the focal area on the right is still stronger is because it has more different types of contrast within it. It also has edge, and it also has value, and it also has shape, whereas this has only value. And so you end up with this kind of hierarchy where, generally speaking, contrast of value is the easiest to use, but it doesn't have to be the only one. If we had line art in this scene, for example, we could contrast the line art as well. So contrast of line. To pop this even further forward, we can add contrast of detail. So for instance, if this is a building and we've got a lot of detail on it and not a lot anywhere else, that will also make it jump out, right? So it's not really important to memorize all of these types. Really, the takeaway that I want you to be aware of is that any element of art, whether that's the line art or the color or the value or the perspective or the whatever, you can use that to contrast. You can use that to create and control your focal element within your scene. Okay, hopefully everybody's with me so far. This should be pretty familiar to most of you. This is like your basic, when you Google how to control composition, you're going to get a list of these. The reason I wanted to touch on them is because this is essentially our tool belt that we're going to use to make the composition. And the argument I'm trying to make here is a lot of people associate these rules with composition. And I view them more as like these rules are to composition as like a hammer is to a house, right? It's a tool used to build the composition. It's a tool used to build the house, but in and of itself, it is not that. I'm going to give it a second because I see in chat Raging it's having a little bit of issue. I just want to double check that it's not Discord. Okay. Looks like we're okay. All right. So we've got our tool belt now. And we can go into what I'm going to make an argument for is the core of composition. And that's the contrast of the technicals against the story. So when we talk about the technicals, we're talking about those tools. So contrast, we're talking about balance, We're talking about the focal area. We're even talking about artistic fundamentals. So this can include things like the perspective of the scene, the lighting, and when we start to break down, like I'm going to compose an image, what we're trying to do is we are trying to control the technical elements of the scene to tell the story of the scene. Composition at the end of the day is about the story that you are telling, not the way that you are doing it. And this is where I see a lot of people get kind of stuck because they will get really focused on these as being composition, and it's not. These are the tools we use to compose an image. And I really want to I'm going to just hammer that home extremely hard because it's really, really important. And we will have a story in any scene. When we have like I mean, we could even do like an abstract scene. Um, and we want, I don't know, we want this rectangle to feel very imposing and big. So we're going to clip it, we're going to have it going up in 3-point perspective, and we're going to have it towering over this tiny little circle in the foreground who's quivering in fear. Right? Like this is still a story. It's not a story that's like a necessarily a human story. Um, or I guess it still is kind of a human story. But the point being, it's not so literal as like, oh, there's a guy in a cafe, or oh, there's a guy with a sword, or there's a guy leading a charge, or whatever, right? The point is more that this is just it is still a story. It's a visual story. The other thing that I want to hammer home is that a lot of the story and what we associate with story is the feeling or the mood of an image. And again, a lot of people tend to trend towards the technicals as the feeling. The biggest thing I will see is color. People will be like, "Oh, I want my scene to feel sad, so I'm going to make it blue," or I want it to be aggressive, so I'm going to make it red and yellow. And while that is a component, that's still not the feeling of the scene. What we want to do is we want to try to relay whether it's an emotion or a combination. The best is a combination of emotion and story, and we want to relay that to the viewer. So this, in my book, is composition. It is balancing the technicals, meaning the actual tools and techniques that you use to tell the story, against actually telling the story. And this is also why sometimes you'll look on, if you go to like DeviantArt and you look at newer artists or less experienced artists' work, even if they're very, very good with line art and color and stuff like that, sometimes the images will just feel bleh. Like it's kind of hard to put your finger on it. Like the lighting's correct, the character's there, the background perspective's fine, but it's not saying anything. It's not telling any actual like story. It's not transmitting a feeling. The only thing that it's saying is like, this is a character, which is a statement, but it's not a very interesting one. And that's what makes it feel like those are kind of more amateurish. So, with this in mind, um, I want to kind of just roll forward. There was one other thing I wanted to talk about. I'm just missing it. So, give me a second. Oh, that's what it was. I heard an analogy before we get into some concrete examples of this. I heard an analogy for composition in art as throwing a ball at a wall. And this has stuck with me, and this is still what I think about when I compose. So if you throw a ball at a wall, it's going to bounce back to you, but it's going to bounce back with less force than you threw it, right? And when we're making things on a canvas, the ball is like the story and the feeling we're trying to transmit, and we're trying to bounce it through the canvas to the viewer, right? They will always receive a lot less than we put in. And because of that, we have to actually like really accent the crap out of it. And it is possible to over accent. Like there's room for subtlety, but a lot of people tend to under accent the story or the feeling that they're trying to give. So you want to take your story, that's your ball, and you want to just hawk it at the wall as hard as you can, and then hope it bounces back to the viewer. And they're going to receive some of that when they're looking at your art. And in most cases, not all, but in a lot of cases, especially if we're working with like quick read illustration. So that can be things like card illustration, storybook illustration. Like you really want to hum it out. Like you want to pretty much use every trick you can to try to tell that single story as hard as you possibly can. And that's what's going to give you these intentional dynamic feeling compositions. So, with this all in mind, I want to go into some more concrete examples because obviously, with composition, concrete examples are good, and plus, there's pretty art to look at. So, before we go any further, I do want to give a little attribution. The examples we're going to be looking from, I've picked from a specific single book. And I've done this for a couple of reasons. First of all, if you are interested in composition, this isn't sponsored or anything. This book is just genuinely amazing. This is pretty much the best resource I have ever found on composition ever. And it is a book, but it's a very visual book. So if you're not much of a book person, you're still going to enjoy it. Um, this guy, Marcos Mateos Mestre, he does comics, he does visual development for film, and he has a couple different books. He also has one on perspective, but this framed ink book is like the end all be all for composition. So I'll have this attribution at the end as well if you want to copy that name down or whatever. But all of the examples we're looking at are from this book. The other reason I've chosen it is because he's working in black and white. And color is something that people fixate on a lot when it comes to composition. And so telling the story in just black and white kind of helps to remove some of those confusions. Color is an extremely important compositional element, but generally speaking, it is not actually the foundation of a good composition. It will help to tell the story and it will help to push the story in a specific direction. And it is important to make a visually interesting image. But in my mind, the bulk of composition does not come down to color. And so this makes for a really great example because all the examples are in the same style and there's no color involved. Okay, so taking a look here, this is a series of faces. Now, obviously, it's not the exact same shot, but these are all essentially like mid-range shots of a woman, right? Specifically a woman's head. And what I want to point out, this is an example of lighting kind of working as a tool. And I'm going to basically just go through and pick out those kind of toolbox tools that we looked at before. I want to go in and pick out how they're being used to give different feelings to each of these images, because these do tell a story, right? So here, this central image is what I tend to see in like either starting out or junior kind of portfolios. This is very stylized, and actually there's some very nice like calligraphic mark making to it. But this is an example of what I was talking about earlier, where it's not really saying anything about the character. We can see that it's a woman. We can see that she has hair. We can see that she's looking to the right. There's no particular story here, right? This one has a little bit more simply because of the like expression and the fact that we're not relying on lines to tell the story, so there's some value contrast. So it feels a little more interesting. And it feels a little more intense because of that, because there's some of these lines are basically we're playing hide and seek with them, but it still isn't like super duper strong. When we start to play, in this case with lighting, via the tools that we talked about, mostly this is going to be coming down to contrast of value and contrast of edge. We start to get actual stories. So here, this has a feeling behind it. This has an eerie, creepy, I'm going to get you kind of a feeling to it. And it's because of the lighting that was chosen for this scene. It's because of these like chaotic hatchy marks that are being used to hatch in that lighting. It could have just as easily been left dark, but they didn't. The artist hatched those in to give some feeling to it. That's an example of contrast of line. We've got a little bit of contrast of edge as well. Not all of these are totally blocked in. And we're looking straight at the figure as well. It's like a perfect direct straight on look, which is a choice to give that kind of extra feeling. And so there are a series of choices with the tools that are starting to tell a story here. I like this one a lot. This is another one here where the majority of the image is just black. And in fact, it's not only just black, but they've like fully blacked it in. And then we just get this little bit of light across the character's face, and we can't even see one of the eyes, right? We just see one. This gives this sense of like intrigue. And the reason that this works is because our brains are still monkey brains. Like if we can't see something in an image, it feels mysterious, like literally, because it is mysterious to our brains because they cannot see it. Um, we have some other examples later on where we'll see this play out again. But like another good example is this bottom one. Like this feels like a somewhat scary figure. And you'll see this as well in anime art where if a character has like malicious intent, you'll see them and their face will be blank, or their face will be blacked out or blurred out somehow. It's because with their little brains, we look at that and we're like, I know that it's a human shape, but it doesn't look human, and that inherently has an unsettling feeling to it. It also, we can't read the expression of the character, so we can't tell their intent. This character could be super happy and smiling. They're coming in from a happy day and they're holding a fresh baked cake, but we can't see that in the image, so the image does not have that feel. Um, this one feels less imposing because we can see some of their expression and we can see that they're not actually looking at us. So we're not the target of whatever they're conniving here. And therefore, it feels a little bit more comfortable than this bottom one. And as we keep getting into this, I don't want you to take these as hard and fast rules, because part of the thing that makes composition really fun is that it's very loose. It's very much literally more of an art than a science. And there kind of are no like right or wrong answers. There's just different approaches to doing, like different ways to do things. So that is, yeah, basically that's, just keep that in mind. If you asked like whatever, four different artists to make this feeling in an image, they would all approach it very slightly differently. Um, so other things here, we can see the smile. So we can tell part of the character's expression, but we can't see the eyes. So it feels a little bit like, maybe they don't have the best of intention. Here we can see all of the facial expression. We can't really see where they're looking, but we get more detail in here. So it ends up being like they are maybe more just mysterious, but not immediately threatening. Same thing here. This is like a more dramatic kind of lighting. We see they're looking off to the side. Same actually here. This is a great example of, we are using three values, so we can actually see a reasonable amount about the character. This doesn't feel like an uncomfortable image. Here, give me just 1 second. Sorry, guys, this is being recorded. So just so you know, I can hear you through my noise canceling. Yeah, anyway, it's all good. Um, so yeah, here's an example of like, we can see all of the character. And yeah, basically being able to see their expression makes it not as scary, but it's still dramatic. So here's some lighting. The other thing we can do is, we're gonna like go down the rabbit hole of the monkey brain. A good example is like, we can choose our camera shots. We can choose our camera shots to try to tell our story. So here we've got the explanation, but they're doing a top-down shot with all of this black around here, so we can't see what's in the jungle exactly the same way that the soldier in the shot cannot see. We're using the toolbox to make sure that the focal point is the soldier. Because if we tried to draw all of these leaves in with lines and value and light and dark, it would just be an overwhelming composition and it wouldn't read very well. So we're reserving this lightest value here for the soldier to pop him out. And then we can see this water. We can't even see his feet. So like, we get very little information about his environment, which is intentional. We're also looking down on it, so it's kind of this sense of uh like maybe we're the creature kind of a thing. Like, it just gets the sense that there's something else lurking or going on. And if we wanted to add like a second focal point to this image, we could put like a little set of eyes over here, for example, if we wanted to make it more eerie. We could put some eyes over here. I'm sure you guys have seen images like this where there's eyes, but everywhere the soldier's not looking. So we can still use like those contrasts, but now as soon as I do that, you'll see that our attention's pulled away from just the soldier, and we get a primary read on the soldier and a secondary read on these eyes because they're so high value. If we wanted to hide that a little bit more, we could do like this darker value here, where it could be kind of part of the foliage or it could be some eyes, but the fact that we've got this repeating pattern is going to start to feel more like eyes. So again, going back to our initial kind of toolbox, we're using some of those tools. And here, like, if we were to put this in this kind of semicircle around him, it feels like he's hemmed in, he's stuck. A lot of composition is the feeling, like the actual feeling of the image. I know that doesn't make sense, so give me a second. I'm just going to try to figure out a different way to say that. Um, the when we put our like perception, we tend to relate to the main character or the focal point of the image just when we're looking at it. And so what is happening to them to some extent will happen to your viewer. It's the best way I can describe it. We're going to see some other examples of it later on in here. A lot of this is, again, more of an art than a science, but I just want you to be kind of like thinking about these things. Um, okay, so here we're looking down on the soldier, and so he feels small to us. So he feels like he's a small force against an overwhelming jungle around him. Here's the opposite example. It's still soldiers in a jungle, but we're looking up at them. They feel independent and heroic, right? And we get a lot more open sky. It doesn't feel as claustrophobic of an image. This bro is like barely able to even fit in the frame because he's so big. So he feels very strong, very imposing. It mentions down here as well, like they're looking in different directions. They're not like both looking at the same thing, so they feel fairly independent, fairly capable. We're still getting our contrast, like we still have our just basic read of the image, right? We still get our main focal point here and our secondary focal point here. We're getting a little bit of a leading line or triangle with this tree cutting across. But that's just the tools being used to tell the story of these two heroic adventurers. And notice in these two, like, yes, it is a different shot, but one of the main things that we changed was the camera. So the camera, and we talked just last week about how to change like horizon line and how to change like focal length of the camera and stuff like that. When you're framing up shots, like you can use that to tell a story. And this is going back again to where I'm saying like everything that you put on the canvas is an element of your composition. And you can like the rule is there are no rules, right? Like you can use color, you can use perspective, you can use the camera, you can use the light and shadow, you can use the edges, the lines, like any of this. And ideally, you'll be using multiple of those elements in conjunction to a similar end goal. This was another image that I really liked, and this way back in the day when I was looking through, like first getting started on composition, this one stuck with me. This is another example of a very literal read. So we've got the same shot in three different ways, and this is telling three completely different stories. And even if we take away the fact that, here we see the cafe sign, for example, right? Because that's helping to tell the story. But most of the story is told by the values in this case and the lighting. Here we've got nothing physically between the characters. So again, this is monkey brain logic. There is nothing here, therefore they see eye to eye. And it literally works like that. So we have this nice little frame that the characters are sitting in. There's nothing between them, so there's no tension like visually between the two characters. And so that translates as they're having a fairly friendly conversation in a cafe, and there's no like abstract tension between them. Contrast that with this one down here. Oops. This one down here, where there's a bunch of shit in between them, right? And so now it does not feel like they're seeing eye to eye because they quite literally aren't. There's stuff. We still get the same read. So from a technical standpoint, like we still have our same focal points. It's still the guy and it's still the girl. But the story being told by those focal elements is very different. And that's being done by the composition. And that's like the point that I'm trying to make with this whole lecture is that just using the elements of contrast or just using the technicals alone is not in and of itself composition, because you could make the argument that the focal point is the same in these. Like the focal elements and the key elements of the scene are the same, but the story is somehow different. So composition has to boil down to what is telling the story, like what is making it different. So yeah, here there's a bunch of stuff in between them. There's a bunch of broken lines. We get the sense that these characters are having some sort of a conflict or that their marriage is falling apart or something, because there's literal like stuff between them. And here, this is another example of even a different story. Whenever we have more information about a character, we tend to relate to them more. So both of these characters have roughly the same like contrast of value and edge and everything like that. But we're going to relate more to the female character on the side because we can see more of her. And this composition tells the story that the male character has some ill intent. This is like I'm going to make you an offer you can't refuse kind of a vibe. It's because like we see this character, we see her face, and we see that there's no ill intent, but we don't know what's going on with this guy. And so focal elements across all three of these stay the same. Story is completely different. Um, this is one of those examples that's just like stuck with me ever since I first saw it, and this is still what I think about when I'm composing stuff. Um, we talked a little bit about like in that last shot, the like obstacles between the character. You can take that even further and like play with the placement of elements in your scene. So this is also what I was talking about, like the claustrophobic feeling before. Here, they've literally placed this guy in this little box. Like it is claustrophobic because he is literally claustrophobic. Um, and he's still the focal point. We're not sacrificing that, but we've got all of these like leading lines pointing directly to his head. And like in this case, this is a person under arrest, and the image makes him feel under arrest. And I'm sure you can see how this image tells that story much better than if we saw the same scene from like a side shot where he's on the ground. I'll just do a little derpy sketch over here. Like this is where the art of composition comes in, because we could tell this same exact story with, let's say, the guy kneeling in the foreground with his hands cuffed behind his back like this, and the two policemen are standing here. But the story feels different, right? Because now, first of all, we're going to be relating to the guy because he's on our side and the policemen are against him. Again, monkey brain logic, right? So now we're like, this is our boy. We're backing him up because we're looking over the shoulder at him, and the policemen suddenly become an imposing figure, and maybe like the bad guy. Over here, this guy feels like the bad guy for sure. We can see he does not look like a cool dude. Um, and so telling it this way instead of that way tells the story that the artist wanted to tell in a more direct and a more interesting way. The other thing is when we take a more straightforward approach to composition like this, your image is just from an objective standpoint going to look more samey with other images because things like this are easier to make. But here we're using every single tool in the tool belt to tell our story. And that's what makes the composition feel so striking and so dramatic. Um, I also really like the thing that stuck with me about this one is this gun, like literally adding pressure to his head, right? So I think this stuff is really, really cool. So yeah, there's like your placement of elements. You can do the same thing if you've got like a character in like a valley, or if you were trying to do like, I don't know, a spelunker, and you're trying to give this sense of claustrophobia as they're going deeper and deeper into the cave. You could do something like that. You could literally put foreground elements like pressing on them. Even though they're on different picture planes, our brains will still interpret. Um, Moving right along, so we've talked about like placements of elements within a single scene. It would be inaccurate and incomplete to not mention the composition of the page as a whole. So this will apply more to comic artists. But when I say anytime you put anything on the page, it is a composition, I mean that. So here we have arguably 5 or 4 different illustrations, right? But the images are composed in a way that tells the story. So here, the story that we're telling is that there's a bridge. This guy is running down to try to get to cover before it blows up. And so he literally runs down the page into cover while the bridge blows up. And then we see the aftermath over here. And like this could have been told in your standard comic panel format where it's like just 3 and 3 or 6 or whatever. But we're using every single tool in our toolbox to try to tell that story. And so in this case, the artist chose a sloping composition for the panels on the page, which is a really, really effective way of telling that story. We get that sense, and our eyes literally follow the character as he runs from the bridge, ducks behind cover, the bridge blows, and we cut to this side shot over here, the aftermath. So another example of like everything is a composition. And then I want to show you an example of like I said, there's no right answers, right? This breaks a lot of rules. This breaks a lot of rules. Um, let's see. We've got very little going on. Our focal element is obscured by something that is not important to our scene. We've got a random cloud over here, which is unbalancing the image for no apparent reason. And when we break a lot of rules, this can still be a strong composition depending on the story we're telling. in this panel, in like the story of this panel, this is a shot in like an alien invasion kind of a film. And so it's showing like the before, but it's supposed to feel a little bit unsettling. And when there's things that are placed in our composition that aren't there for any particular purpose or reason, it's gonna give that feeling. Like this is a balanced composition. We're quite literally looking at the balance like this, right? So it's a balanced composition. There's no action happening right now, but it still feels unsettling somehow. And so that's why that's working. That's how they're using those elements. And this is why I say that like you have to kind of get out of your head. I put in my notes here like no right answers because I guess you could argue that there are wrong answers. There are compositions that would work less well than other types of compositions. An example is like the policeman shot that we looked at before. Like taking that shot from a purely side on, given the story that it's trying to tell, would be a less correct answer than the shot that the artist took, right? So in that sense, I guess you could argue that there kind of sort of are wrong answers, but there are no like hard and fast rules. And this is where we'll use thumbnailing. Like as artists, we'll oftentimes thumbnail out our compositions in advance because you can very quickly play with some weird stuff and just see if it vibes. Um, One other example, yeah, rule breaking itself tells a story. Exactly, Janie. So one other example, we talked a little bit about like the elements of composition or the elements of contrast, right? And I'm sure you guys have heard about tangents where you have like an object that perfectly overlaps with another, but they're not on the same picture plane. And most of the time that's a bad thing, right? Here's an example of that being used to give a very unsettling effect about this. This feels like a creepy couple, right? Now, this eh, it could be taken as like a bad composition. If this is supposed to be a normal couple that's swinging by, or you're just like you're noticing the characters where we have tangents absolutely everywhere throughout this image, right? We've even got this thing where like her head's perfectly lined up inside this palm tree. It's very weird, right? And if the story that you're trying to tell is that this is like whatever, just regular investigators swinging by to ask some questions, then this would be a wrong composition. But if the story you're trying to tell is that this is like a very creepy kind of couple next door making the rounds, then this might be a valid composition for that story. And so when we hear about like these rules or these art rules or whatever, take them with a grain of salt and basically apply the ones that are actually relevant to the scene and to the story that you're telling. And this is also why it's extremely important to know the story that you're telling. A lot of times, like I'll see artists jump in to make like a polished illustration, which does matter because if your goal is a study, then the story matters less than the information you're getting out of it. But if you're trying to make a final illustration, and you're not telling a story with it, you're doing yourself a disservice because having a story in mind, even if you can't fully get it through the composition, the process of trying is still going to, in and of itself, give you a more interesting image. And the more you think outside the box with these rules and this kind of toolkit, the more interesting stories you can tell. These examples that I have like pulled aside for you today are examples of like one of the best doing it, but the more you like, as soon as your brain is tuned into this kind of thing, when you go and look at other art, you will see examples of this more and more frequently. And you'll just start to notice it. Fine art, especially Renaissance art, does this a lot. I'm sure everybody's seen like the different value breakdowns of like master studies and stuff like that. There was a period of time where we got really into composition as just as an artistic movement. Um, but these are all examples. Again, none of these even use color. So I'm just making sure I've said everything I want on that. I think so. So yeah, another example of like no right answers, right? This intentionally is breaking rules. Okay, so how do we? That's all fine and good. How do we practically get started on this? So we've. I'm going to assume that I've completely convinced you that you're on board with like great composition is storytelling. How do I start to actually use that in my art? How do I get better at this skill? Fortunately, it's actually pretty straightforward because a lot of composition is just messing around or playing around. So, um, what I would say and what I advise my like students to do is first, when you're making an image that's meant to be a final composition, just jot down the story you're trying to tell and jot down the mood you want to have. And it can be a very simple story. You could have one like there's a kettle boiling morning tea, and I want the image to feel calm. It could be that. It could be as simple as that. But the more specific you can get, the better. And the reason is that, like, even having like this morning tea, right? Like, we can play with the composition to make it feel like morning instead of evening. We could have other elements in the scene that tell a different story. We could even think about like, okay, well, if this is within an established world, maybe the character is boiling the kettle because um, maybe it's not morning tea, maybe it's evening tea, and they've had a really hard day at work. And so we put the kettle in our composition. We've got our little tea kettle boiling on the stove, maybe over here somewhere. This is going to be very fast because I don't want to make you guys sit and watch me sketch. So we've got our tea kettle here, but maybe we can see in the foreground, like, I don't know, they've just finished a glass of bourbon, and we see the empty glass here. We see a rent due notice sitting in the foreground here. We see maybe a scratched out tally of the money that they have on hand. And we clutter the foreground because all of this stuff in the foreground is like stressful. And then we light it so that our tea is our light and savior. The tea is what's going to give the character a bit of reprieve. And so we have a nice calm lighting. We've got the gentle drifting smoke from the tea, right? So that tells a story, right? And if I'm just trying to draw a picture of a kettle, that's not going to give the same impact visually or emotionally as just taking a second to think about, like, I want the kettle to feel calm, and it's like a calm against the storm. And then as soon as you have this is your like nutshell story. I'm sure you can already in your head, because this is a server full of artists, I'm sure you can start thinking of other ways that you could tell this story and other compositions that would work to tell this story. And that's where thumbnailing comes in. If you have a strong story, thumbnailing gets a lot easier because your brain is going to start to flick through images that could work to tell that story. So that's the first step, is try to always have a story if it's a polished illustration. If it's a study, that's something else entirely that we can cover at a different time. But if the goal is a finished illustration, try to say something with it. We're using a visual language. It's important to say something with that language, right? And then the other thing you can do, some kind of quick start, is composition, fortunately, is extremely abstract. So there is nothing wrong with straight up yoinking it. Find a comp that works or a composition that you like, trace it, meaning trace the leading lines and the focal element within that comp, and then change it. So, for instance, with our T thing, we could try to find an image that has a similar feel to what we're going for. And we can do a quick composition study where at the end of it, you're going to have essentially like a red line where you'll have like, okay, here's my like leading lines like this. I've got a panel of light kind of sitting like this, and then there's some dark in the middle where the kettle is. And then there's a lot of like dark hatchy stuff going on down here. And we've got like these kind of abstract shapes. And then you can basically take that as your compositional sketch, and you can start to put your subject and your story into it. There's nothing wrong with that, and doing that will help you to get better at composition because you will be starting from a strong foundation. This is also why I think the rule of threes, or like the golden ratio, is, sure, it's good to know, but it's not really the end all be all, because I don't know, not everything follows that. And if you do this, you're going to be getting that essentially for free without having to really, you don't have to consciously think about it so much. So that's absolutely fair game. One thing I learned about at the Watts, and this works really well for covers, if you're just stuck on compositions, you can do what they would call letter compositions. So that's an example of like, okay, I'm going to do the letter A. This is a really great exercise for composition. Okay, I wanted a composition that looks like the letter A, right? So we make it, I don't know, a guy standing tall, he's like roaring, whatever. And we're just trying to like basically make the objects in our scene follow that kind of a vibe. And we want to come up, you can basically start with the abstract composition and then come up with a story around it. You can do either. It's usually easier to start with a story, but in this case, this would be an exercise where you do the inverse. So here we've got our letter A, and then we make a composition out of it. That's just a good exercise to practice. Um, Other things you can do is if it feels too difficult, make it simpler. Usually, you can tell the story of a composition through very few values, like 3 at most, and not a ton going on within the canvas. I do see students sometimes break their compositions down into like too primitive of forms where they'd be like, okay, here's my focal element, and here's whatever, cliff and another cliff, and there's a city here. Like that's okay, but that's maybe like a little bit too abstract. So start with those shapes, sure, but then push it further and decide like, okay, in this case, these are all straight lines. Do I want that? Do I want these cliffs to feel more rolling? Do I want to show some spiky rocks here pointing back up to my focal area, or do I want it more loopy or whatever? We can get into thumbnailing as like a different topic for like a different week if you guys want to learn more about that. But basically, if it feels overwhelming, keep breaking it down to its simpler components and then build it back up from there. And most people are very good at breaking it down to simple components, but the build it back up, we get a little bit lost. So that's kind of your other trick is like don't just stop there, like keep building, right? Okay, that was a lot of me babbling. I think composition is a really cool topic, so that went longer than usual. But I think that's pretty much all I've got. So again, here's that book if anybody is interested. This is the name of it, and we're going to go ahead and open it up to just question and answer. Now, this can be about anything we've talked about today, if you want, or it can also be just like open forum art questions. So we'll open it up, let everything kind of process from the info dump that you've received. And yeah, does anybody have any questions in the chat, or you can unmute and ask it live? That's fine too. Sure, we're still live. Yeah, we're live. Everybody's so starstruck by the knowledge bomb that has been dropped.
Amazing. This was very useful. I've never
I'm
thought
glad
about
to hear
this
that.
type of.
Yeah, I'm glad to
Yeah,
hear that.
I don't know. But yeah,
No worries.
someone else.
Yeah. I see Reginald's typing, so we'll give that a second. Not a question though. That's fine. No worries. Can type it on out. No pressure. I feel like I'm like Reginald's typing, and then everybody like looks at the chat. Reginald's sitting there at his computer, like at their computer, like sweat beading. I don't mean to put pressure on you. It's all good. And it's totally fine if there's not other questions or color comps. Yeah. So Hananot, that's a great question. For color comps, you basically use the exact same principles. You're just adding a dimension of color. And so some of the stuff that I did talk about where it's like, oh, red feels aggressive and blue feels calm is true. There is like a little bit of a science behind that. Usually when I'm approaching color with composition, I will treat it mostly as an element of contrast. The easiest way to show it, and we'll do this very quickly, if we want to get into color theory, we can also do that on a different thing if that's something that people are interested in. But if I've got a composition where I'm just going to throw kind of abstract colors down, and I'm keeping them all fairly low chroma, so that they all kind of synergize. And then if I want to pop like a focal element here, for example, I can use color and value contrast, and it's going to like boink, pop right out. You can also do that with like rim light. If you had a scene with like a bunch of characters, whatever. I'm inspired by the jungle scene now. This is all green, but let's say we take that composition that we had before, where we had our character here and then another one here, and they're looking off in different directions, right? If we want to further highlight one of those two characters, or if we wanted to imply that like one of them is good and one is maybe not as good, we could use color for that. So let's say that we're struggling with just the values to make it pop. We could add like a hot blue rim light, for example, on this guy, and that's going to make him pop out even further. The one asterisk with that, and what I will say, is color is actually driven by value. It's not the other way around. So Most of the time, color should be treated as like the cherry on top of an already working value composition. Because if you have total like chaos of value and you put structured color on it, it will turn into just mush. But if you have structured value and you put chaotic color into it, it will actually work. The easiest way, this is getting into color theory because they're kind of intrinsically tied together. But the other really fun exercise to do, I'm sure you guys have, at least some of you have seen this, where you'll put like random colors down and you'll like swirl them together and then you'll toggle your canvas to grayscale and paint with that palette. And when you untick it and when you go back into your actual image with color, it will always work. And it's because your values are structured. So value drives color, not the other way around. If you're using color in composition, you should use it as another element of contrast, and you can apply it exactly the same way that we've looked at all of the other elements of contrast today. I hope that answers your question. There are also some people will do, I don't know if you're asking about color compositions, which some people will also do. And that works exactly the same as like value thumbnails. You'll just do it in color. If it's easy for you to think in color, or if you already have an idea of the colors that you want in the scene, it works really well. I tend not to do it because I prefer working in value first and then working up to color. But color comps are a very traditional way of working. Sometimes you'll also use color comps to figure out just the color. So you'll start with a value thumbnail, and then you will paint colors on top of it to decide which colors you want for your image. Long-winded answer. Hopefully one of those ticked the box for the question you were asking.
I actually have a question.
Yeah, shoot.
So do you have like a recommendation for color composition?
Yeah. So what do you mean a recommendation? Are you looking for like a resource to learn about it
Yeah,
or
like a
an
book or yeah, like somewhere to look deeper into it. You would recommend.
question? Let me think for a minute. Um,
Okay.
The problem with color pumps is that there's a lot of ways to do it, and it basically boils down to like most of it boils down to color theory. Um, so any resource that addresses color theory is good. There's on YouTube a guy named Marco Bucci, is really, really amazing for color, especially digital color. So I can put his name, I'll just write it out here. You can look him up,
Okay, thank you.
Marco Bucci. There's also an illustrator that I'm trying to remember. It's a she. Crap, what was her name? She does like anime style stuff. I'm not remembering it right now. But she has a bunch of stuff on like visual storytelling, and she uses color as a major component of that. Not Bob Ross. Um, yeah, if anybody in chat thinks of it, she does the like line and color style, very vaguely Ghibli style anime illustrations. I don't know if I'm drawing a total blank. I'm sorry. Janie. But
You're
Marco
good.
Bucci will get you a good start for sure. And then a lot of
Thank
it,
you.
if you're treating color as an element of your composition, don't be afraid, especially
Mhm.
if you're digital, to just like block something in and then hue shift it around until it feels right. That's what I'll do a lot of time
Okay.
with color, where you just kind of block in your best guess for colors. And if you block them in on different layers or using like layer modes, you can kind of shift it around until it starts to harmonize and feel right.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem. Alrighty. Let's see. Reginald says it kind of clicked for me the fact that to do a type of composition, it's as important to think of what you want to tell as it is to think of the opposite. So you want calm, put stressing or mess in the composition, but slightly off central. Yeah, exactly. Because you can make a calm composition and that will be like, oh, that's nice. But if you want like the focal area to feel calm, then you can contrast that against mess everywhere else. And this is also
Mhm.
something, this also gets into color theory. But a lot of times, here, I'll show this real quick since I've got a color ground already down. A lot of times I'll have students where they will be trying to make their color in their image work. And it's like, this just isn't working and I don't know why. And they'll have a background where there's a lot of color going on. And so here, I'm going to give an example real quick. I'm just painting these little figures out because I did this all in one. So if we take this and here's that hue shifting I was talking about, I'm just going to crank the saturation on it. And then they'll have like a focal element like this, and it's like, I want this to feel more green, and it just doesn't feel green, and I don't know how, because I can't go more green. Like this is as green as I can get, right? And anytime that you're making an adjustment to your image, you can do it one of two ways. You can either make the thing more, or you can make everything else less. What I mean by that is like if we've got our green ball that we want here and we want this to feel more green, we can make it more green by increasing the chroma of that ball, or we can make it more green by decreasing the chroma of everything else. And you see how that immediately reads as green? This is technically color theory, but it applies to composition as well. Because, for example, if you're like, oh, I want a crisp hard edge, but it just doesn't read as a hard edge, you can literally like fuzz other stuff out. And then it will read as a more hard edge. Or if you're like, oh, I just want this, whatever, this cloth to feel really soft, like make other things in the scene feel really sharp and hard. And then the cloth will feel softer by comparison. So yeah, that's a good point out, Rage Nord. Such a thing as a really bad idea that would be really hard to make a composition for. Um, I mean, I don't know about like bad ideas. The big thing that jumps out to me as like compositions that will be problematic or are very difficult to pull off is compositions that are trying to say two completely opposite things. And generally, those are what I would call like a bad composition. So if my story is that like whatever, if the vibe that I'm trying to put across is calm, but I'm like, okay, I want an image where it's calm but also tense. Like that's going to be very hard to do. You could make a sea of calm in an area of tension, or you could make like a character that's calm in a busy cityscape, but having the image itself feel both calm but also tense is hard. And that's where you have to get real creative. This is a good example of that. This is calm but tense. And it's very hard to do. It's possible, it's just hard. Other things that are really hard to show is if a character is having conflicting emotions. Oftentimes, you have to get pretty creative about that because you can only really show, like, for the most part, you can only really show one actual emotion on their face. So you have to do that with blends of lighting or with color or other compositional tools to show the other half. Sometimes this will be shown as like reflections in a mirror. Sometimes it'll be shown as like um, I've seen a really popular one on like social media because it feels very deep, is where you'll have a character that's like smiling, but you realize that they're smiling and it's a mask, and underneath they're crying or something. That's a pretty on the nose way of doing it, and it's become a little bit of a cliche because a lot of people do that, but it's another example. Eigen says, my fave book is Hans Bacher's Vision, Color and Composition for Film. That sounds very good. I have not read that specific one, so I can't confirm or deny. But especially if it's anything for film, actually, that reminds me, anything for film is going to be very good. Yes, Rage Nord just posted the meme in there. That's like a very simple version of it. But yeah, there was a period of time in art where that was a really novel idea, and DeviantArt was like flooded with those. Um, but yeah, so that actually ties back to your question a little bit as well, Janie. You could probably look at that book that Eigen just posted, because anything for film really is paying very close attention to color. It's very
Thank you.
intrinsic. By the way, Rage Lord, up like major props for having that on speed dial. I don't know how you found that fast, but plus plus. Okay, nice. Hans Bacher was production artist for classic Disney films like The Lion King and Mulan. Very nice. Okay. Any other questions we have at the moment? The lecture went a little longer this week, so our Q&A is a little bit shorter, but we still have a little bit of time if anybody else has some last minute stuff. Going once, going twice. All right. I think we'll go ahead and call it there. So yeah, thanks everybody for joining. Really, I really appreciate it. I hope you got something or learned something. I hope I succeeded in my goal of red pilling you on composition. If you have other requests, this was a request by Toyohito. So Toyohito, thank you very much for the lesson request or the lecture request. My goal is to get you guys the information that you actually want. So I can just come up with random things to talk about. But if you want to see something specific, please just DM me and say, hey, I've got an idea. It makes my job easier because I don't have to think about like what am I going to teach about, but also I know that it's going to be on topic. If you enjoyed the lesson stuff, like, and you know of somebody else who might like it, bring somebody in. It helps grow the server. We get new people in here, and then my goal, I've got some pretty cool speakers kind of lined up in the back, but I want to get a fairly consistent group of people coming each week before I start tapping like people to come in and either guest host or guest speak or anything like that. So the more the merrier, and also the more interesting and diverse questions we tend to get when we have more and more people. And then, yeah, if you want to review anything that we have here, there are channels in this channel group in the Discord server where I'll be uploading recordings so you can look back. The audio, unfortunately, is not great because I don't have a real mic yet. That problem will be solved soon, but for now, the information's there, and I guess I don't have a good solve beyond that. So that's all I got. But yeah, thank you so much for swinging by, everybody. Uh, Hugely appreciated. And this happens every week. So we will see you next week. Of
Yep, thank you so much.
course.
Bye.
Bye bye.